The crisis negotiator didn't panic when the man with the gun started screaming, and the Korean crime lord listening from outside the convenience store recognized her voice instantly. It was 2 a.m. in Itaewon, and the street was empty except for police cars with their lights painting the wet pavement in red and blue. Inside the GS-25, a man in his 20s held a clerk and 2 customers at gunpoint, his hands shaking, his voice breaking as he shouted demands that made no sense. He wanted money, then he wanted a car, then he wanted everyone to understand that he wasn't a bad person, that he'd just lost everything, that nobody cared, that maybe if he did this, someone would finally listen. If you're ready for a story that will twist your mind and break your heart in ways you never expected, hit that subscribe button right now, because nothing about this story is what it seems. The police had the building surrounded. Snipers on roofs, tactical units behind vehicles, a hostage negotiation team setting up equipment in a van parked half a block away. And standing at the perimeter, watching everything with the detached interest of a man who understood violence intimately, was Kang Seo-jun. 40 years old, owner of 3 legitimate restaurant chains and 7 less legitimate operations. A man who had spent 20 years building an empire on the principle that power came from knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. He was here because one of the hostages was his accountant's daughter, and his accountant had called him in tears, begging for help, not understanding that Seo-jun had no power here, that even men like him had to wait for the police to do their jobs. But then the negotiation started, and everything changed. The police had established contact through the store's phone. A woman's voice came through the speakers they'd set up, calm, measured, speaking in perfect Korean with an American accent. Her name was Jasmine Carter, they said, a crisis counselor who volunteered with the Seoul Police Department's hostage response unit. She wasn't a cop, just someone trained to talk to people on the worst days of their lives. Seo-jun heard her voice and the world compressed into a single point. The rain stopped mattering. The police radios became static. The flashing lights faded into background noise. Everything reduced itself to the sound of a woman speaking, and his entire body responded like it was remembering something his mind had tried to forget. That voice. He knew that voice. 6 years. He had carried it inside his chest like a second heartbeat for 6 years, and now here it was again, speaking through police speakers at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in Itaewon. Inside the convenience store, the gunman was crying. Jasmine's voice came through steady, unhurried. I hear you saying you've lost everything. That sounds incredibly painful. Can you tell me your name? The man's response was muffled, angry. Jasmine didn't push. She waited. Silence was a tool she wielded with surgical precision. You don't have to tell me your name if you're not ready. But I want you to know I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm gonna stay on this phone as long as you need me to. Seo-jun moved closer to the perimeter without realizing his feet were moving. His head of security, a man named Park who had been with him for 8 years, followed at a respectful distance, confused but silent. Seo-jun stood 20 feet from the negotiation van, close enough to hear every word clearly, and listened as Jasmine Carter talked a desperate man down from the edge. She didn't use tactics. She didn't manipulate or cajole. She just spoke to him like he was a person worth listening to, like his pain mattered, like the fact that he was holding a gun didn't define everything about who he was. 30 minutes later, the man put down the weapon. He walked out with his hands up, sobbing. The hostages were released unharmed. Police moved in. The scene was over. But Seo-jun stood in the rain long after everyone else had dispersed, staring at the now empty convenience store, his hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since the night 6 years ago when he stood on the edge of his apartment balcony and decided whether or not to jump. He had found her. After 6 years of carrying her voice in his memory like a ghost, he had found her. The next morning, Seo-jun sat in his office overlooking the Han River and made a phone call. The man who answered was named Lee, a private investigator who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. I need everything, Seo-jun said. A woman named Jasmine Carter, American, works with Seoul Police as a crisis counselor. I need her address, her history, her routine. Everything. Lee knew better than to ask why. By evening, Seo-jun had a file on his desk. Jasmine Carter, 32 years old, born in Atlanta, Georgia. Bachelor's degree in psychology from Emory University, master's in counseling from Columbia. She'd worked as a crisis intervention specialist in New York for 4 years before moving to Seoul 3 years ago. She volunteered with the police department twice a week, and the rest of the time she worked at a call center for an international suicide prevention hotline, taking calls from across Asia in English and Korean. She lived alone in a small apartment in Yongsan. No family in Korea. No close relationships the investigator could identify. She kept to herself, lived quietly, and by all accounts was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman dedicated to helping people in crisis. But there was a gap in her file. 6 years ago, there was a year where her employment history went blank. No job, no school, no records, just a hole where 12 months should have been. Seo-jun stared at that gap for a long time, and something cold moved through his chest. He knew what gaps like that meant. Something had happened to her 6 years ago, something bad enough that she'd stopped existing on paper for a year. The timing aligned perfectly with the night he'd called the suicide hotline. The night a woman with a calm voice had stayed on the phone with him for 3 hours while he stood on his balcony at 4 a.m. and told her about his wife and daughter. They had died 6 months earlier. A car bombing meant for him, detonated outside a restaurant where his wife had taken their 6-year-old daughter for lunch. He wasn't supposed to survive what came after. The grief should have killed him. The guilt should have been enough. But he'd stayed alive out of spite, out of rage, out of the hollow understanding that dying would be easier than living, and he'd never taken the easy path in his life. Until the night 6 months later when the rage finally burned out and all that was left was the weight. He'd stood on that balcony for 2 hours before he called the hotline. He'd dialed the number 3 times before he let it connect. And when the woman answered, he'd almost hung up. But her voice stopped him. Not what she said, just the sound of it. Calm, clear, present. Like she had nowhere else to be. Like his pain was the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment. She'd asked his name. He'd said he couldn't give it. She'd said that was fine. She'd asked if he was safe. He'd said no, not really. He was standing on a balcony and thinking about how quiet it would be if he just stepped off. And she hadn't panicked. She hadn't told him to step back or threatened to call the police or done any of the things he'd expected. She just said, "That sounds like you're in a lot of pain. Can you tell me about it?" And he had. For 3 hours, he'd told a stranger on a phone about his wife's laugh and his daughter's obsession with butterflies, and the way the guilt was eating him alive from the inside out. He'd told her things he'd never told anyone, and she'd listened without judgment, without solutions, without trying to fix him. Just listening, just being there. At the end of the call, as the sun started to rise, she'd said something he'd never forgotten. "The pain you're feeling right now, it's real and it's enormous. But pain isn't permanent. It changes shape. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that crushes you. You don't have to believe me right now, but I'm asking you to wait. Just wait until morning. See what the daylight looks like. See if the pain is different in the sun." He'd waited. He'd stepped back from the edge. He'd watched the sun come up over Seoul. And he'd decided to live, not because the pain was gone, but because a stranger's voice had made him believe it might be survivable. He'd never gotten her name. The hotline was anonymous. He tried to find her, but the organization wouldn't release information about their counselors. So he'd carried her voice in his memory, a ghost that had saved his life and then disappeared. Now he knew her name. Now he knew where she lived. Now he could repay the debt that had been sitting in his chest for 6 years like a stone he couldn't swallow. Seo-jun stood up from his desk and looked out at the city. Park appeared in the doorway, silent, waiting for instructions. "Prepare a gift," Seo-jun said. "Something appropriate for someone who saved your life. Something that says thank you without demanding anything in return." Park hesitated. "Sir, if I may ask, what is this about?" Seo-jun turned from the window. 6 years ago, I was going to die. A woman I'd never met convinced me not to. I just found her, and I'm going to make sure she never wants for anything again." Park's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "Understood, sir. What kind of gift did you have in mind?" "Something that helps her do what she does," Seo-jun said. "Find out what the suicide hotline needs. Funding, equipment, whatever. Make a donation in her name. Anonymous, substantial. Enough that they notice. Park nodded and left. Seo-jun sat back down and opened the file again. He looked at the photograph the investigator had included. A candid shot of Jasmine leaving her apartment building. Her hair pulled back, a backpack over one shoulder, her face turned toward the morning sun. She looked tired. She looked like someone who carried other people's pain for a living and had learned to move through the world quietly so she didn't add to the weight. He stared at that photograph for a long time, and something in his chest that had been locked tight for 6 years started to crack open. Not love, not yet, but something close. Recognition. The understanding that this woman, this stranger, had seen him at his absolute worst and hadn't looked away. That night, Jasmine came home from her shift at the call center to find a package outside her apartment door. No return address, just her name written in careful Korean script. She brought it inside, cautious, and opened it at her kitchen table. Inside was a letter on expensive paper, written in English. The letter explained that an anonymous donor had made a substantial contribution to the International Crisis Hotline in her name, enough to fund 3 new counselor positions for 2 years. The letter didn't say who the donor was or why they'd chosen her, just that someone wanted to honor the work she did and make sure she could keep doing it. Jasmine read the letter 3 times. Her hands were shaking. She set it down and stood up and walked to her window and looked out at the city lights and felt something move through her chest that was too complicated to name. Gratitude, yes, but also suspicion. And underneath that, something deeper. Fear. She'd been in Seoul for 3 years, and in that time she'd been very careful to be invisible. She didn't make friends. She didn't date. She worked, she volunteered, she went home. She'd rebuilt her life brick by brick on the principle that the safest way to exist was to leave no footprint, to be someone nobody noticed or remembered. And now someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to find out her name, to learn where she lived, to make a donation in her honor. Someone was paying attention. The fear that moved through her was old and familiar. It tasted like the year she'd lost, the 12 months that didn't exist in any file or record because she'd spent them in therapy and hospitals and courtrooms, trying to remember and then trying to forget. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and breathed slowly, using the techniques she taught other people. Ground yourself. 5 things you can see. 4 things you can hear. 3 things you can touch. She went through the list until her heart rate slowed and her hands stopped shaking. Then she folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and decided to forget about it. But forgetting wasn't something Jasmine was good at anymore, no matter how hard she tried. The second package arrived a week later. This time it was a gift basket, expensive, filled with tea and chocolate and a small card that said, "Thank you for the work you do." The handwriting was the same. Still no name. Jasmine stared at the basket for a long time before she threw it away, card and all. The third gift came 3 days after that. A book, first edition, one she'd mentioned wanting in a casual conversation with a coworker at the call center. She hadn't told anyone else. She'd barely thought about it herself. But someone had been listening. Someone had remembered. Jasmine sat on her couch with the book in her hands and felt her breathing start to go shallow. This wasn't gratitude anymore. This was surveillance. She called the building security and asked if anyone had been asking about her. The guard said no, but he'd noticed a man in a nice suit leaving packages for her 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Foreign-looking guy, Korean, always polite, never stayed long. Did she want them to stop accepting deliveries for her? Yes, Jasmine said. And if he comes back, tell him I said to stop. The guard agreed. She hung up and sat in the silence of her apartment and tried to convince herself that this was nothing. Just an overenthusiastic, grateful stranger. Nothing to worry about. But her body knew better. Her body had been trying to tell her something for weeks now, and she'd been ignoring it. The panic attacks had started small. A tightness in her chest when she walked home from work. A sudden spike of adrenaline when she heard footsteps behind her on the street. The feeling of being watched that she couldn't shake no matter how many times she looked over her shoulder and saw nothing. She told herself it was stress. Just the accumulated weight of listening to people in crisis every day and absorbing their pain without anywhere to put it. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Her body was remembering something her mind had locked away. And the gifts, the anonymous attention, the feeling of being seen, it was pulling at the edges of that locked door, trying to force it open. That night, she dreamed about a room. Dark, concrete, the smell of gasoline and rust. The sound of a man's voice, low, speaking Korean. She couldn't see his face. She never could in the dreams. But she could hear him. And in the dream, she was afraid. When she woke up, it was 3 a.m. and she was crying and she couldn't remember why. If this story is already getting under your skin, if you're feeling the tension build and you need to know what happens next, smash that like button right now. Because this is just the beginning. The meeting happened by accident, or at least that's what Seo-jun told himself. He was having dinner at a restaurant in Itaewon when he saw her walk in. Jasmine, alone, sitting at a table by the window with a book and a cup of tea. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't even known she'd be here. But the universe had given him an opportunity, and he took it. He stood up from his own table, ignored Park's subtle headshake of warning, and walked over to her. "Excuse me," he said in English. His accent was thick but clear. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to say thank you." Jasmine looked up from her book. Her eyes were guarded, cautious. "For what?" "For what you do," Seo-jun said. "I heard about the convenience store last week. The way you talked that man down. It was remarkable. You saved lives." Jasmine's expression didn't change. "I was just doing my job." Still, Seo-jun said, "Not everyone could do what you do. It takes a special kind of strength to stay calm when everyone else is panicking." Jasmine closed her book slowly. She looked at him with the kind of assessment that came from years of reading people in crisis, trying to determine if they were dangerous or just desperate. "Do I know you?" she asked. "No," Seo-jun said. "But I know what it's like to be in a dark place and have someone pull you back. I wanted you to know that the work you do matters. More than you probably realize." Jasmine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Are you the one who's been sending me gifts?" Seo-jun hesitated. He'd prepared for this conversation a dozen different ways in his mind. But now that he was standing in front of her, all his carefully planned words disappeared. "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I just wanted to express my gratitude." "For what?" Jasmine's voice was flat, controlled. "What exactly are you grateful for?" "For the work you do," Seo-jun said. "For being someone who helps people when they need it most." Jasmine stood up. She was shorter than him, but the way she held herself made the height difference irrelevant. "I don't know what you think you know about me," she said quietly, "but I need you to stop. No more gifts. No more thank you notes. No more showing up places I happen to be. This, whatever this is, it needs to end right now." Seo-jun felt something in his chest twist. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You're making me feel watched," Jasmine said. "You're making me feel like I'm not safe in my own city. And I don't care how grateful you are or how much money you have or what you think you owe me. I want you to leave me alone." She picked up her book and her bag and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Seo-jun stood there in the middle of the dining room, aware that every person at every table was staring at him, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not guilt, not regret. Shame. The hot, crawling sensation of having done something wrong and having it pointed out in public. Park appeared at his elbow. "Sir, we should go." Seo-jun nodded and let himself be guided out of the restaurant and into the car waiting outside. They drove in silence for 10 minutes before Seo-jun finally spoke. "I handled that poorly." Park, to his credit, said nothing. "I thought," Seo-jun continued, "that if she knew I was grateful, if she understood how much she'd helped me, it would mean something. But she doesn't remember me. She talks to hundreds of people. I was just another voice on the phone, and now I'm just another man making her uncomfortable." He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. "She told me to leave her alone." "Yes, sir. So that's what I'll do." Park glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "If I may, sir, it sounds like she's been through something." The way she reacted, that wasn't just discomfort. That was fear. Seo-jun opened his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Park continued carefully, "that maybe there's a reason she doesn't want attention. Maybe something happened that made her need to be invisible. And maybe by trying to thank her, you're threatening the safety she's built." Seo-jun sat with that for a long time. When they arrived at his building, he told Park to cancel the remaining gifts he'd ordered and to make sure the investigator destroyed all files related to Jasmine Carter. "I don't want to know anything else," Seo-jun said. "I don't want to be the reason she's afraid." He went up to his apartment and sat in the dark and tried very hard not to think about the way her hands had been shaking when she told him to leave her alone. But leaving her alone turned out to be harder than he'd anticipated. Not because he was following her or sending gifts or doing any of the things he'd promised himself he wouldn't do, but because he kept seeing her. She volunteered at a community center 3 blocks from one of his restaurants. She got coffee at a shop he passed every morning on his way to the office. She took the same subway line he used. Seoul was a city of 10 million people, and somehow their paths kept crossing in ways that felt like the universe refusing to let him forget. And every time he saw her, even from a distance, his body responded in ways that confused him. His heart rate increased. His palms went damp. A low-level anxiety hummed through his nervous system, like his body was trying to tell him something his brain wasn't ready to hear. 2 months after the restaurant confrontation, Seo-jun was having dinner with business associates at an upscale restaurant in Gangnam when Jasmine walked in. She was with a colleague from the crisis center, a Korean woman in her 50s, and they were seated 3 tables away. Seo-jun saw her and felt his entire body go rigid. Park noticed immediately. "Sir?" "I'm fine," Seo-jun said, but his voice sounded wrong even to his own ears. The dinner continued. Seo-jun participated in the conversation, laughed at jokes, made the appropriate responses. But his attention was fractured. Half of him was at his own table, and half was watching Jasmine 3 tables away. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the calm, measured gestures he recognized from the convenience store negotiation. And then, without warning, something shifted. Jasmine looked up from her menu, her eyes scanning the restaurant in that casual way people do when they're checking their surroundings. Her gaze passed over Seo-jun's table, paused, backtracked. Their eyes met, and Jasmine's face went white. Not pale, white. The color draining so fast it looked like she'd been physically struck. Her hands, which had been holding the menu, started to shake. She set the menu down carefully, too carefully, the way you do when you're trying very hard to look normal while your body is screaming that something is wrong. Her colleague said something to her. Jasmine shook her head, stood up abruptly, and walked quickly toward the restroom. Seo-jun watched her go, confused. He hadn't approached her. He hadn't even acknowledged her beyond that brief moment of eye contact. So why did she look like she'd just seen a ghost? Park leaned close. "Sir, I think we should leave." "Why?" "Because," Park said quietly, "that woman looks like she's having a panic attack, and you're the reason." Seo-jun felt something cold move through his stomach. "That's not possible. I haven't done anything." "Sometimes," Park said carefully, "it's not about what you do. It's about what someone remembers." The words hit Seo-jun like a physical blow. He stood up, made apologies to his associates about an urgent matter, and left. But he didn't go far. He stood outside the restaurant, in the cold November air, and waited. 20 minutes later, Jasmine came out. Her colleague was with her, holding her arm, guiding her like someone who needed support. Jasmine's face was still pale, her breathing clearly labored even from a distance. They got into a taxi and drove away, and Seo-jun stood there on the sidewalk feeling like he'd just witnessed something terrible without understanding what it was. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment their eyes had met, trying to understand what he'd seen in her face. Not just fear, recognition, like she'd seen something in him that her mind couldn't place but her body remembered. The next morning, Seo-jun broke his promise. He called the investigator back. "I need you to find out what happened to Jasmine Carter 6 years ago," he said. "There's a gap in her employment history, a year where she disappeared. I need to know why." The investigator hesitated. "Sir, with respect, you told me to destroy those files." "I did. This is different," Seo-jun said. "I think." And he paused, trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand yet. "I think something happened to her. Something bad. And I think I might be connected to it somehow." "How is that possible?" "Just find out what happened." The investigator worked for 3 days. When he called back, His voice was careful, the tone of a man delivering news he knew would be unwelcome. 6 years ago, Jasmine Carter was taken hostage during a kidnapping. She was one of 3 victims held for ransom in a warehouse in Incheon. The kidnappers were amateurs, part of a small gang trying to make money from wealthy targets. It went wrong. 1 victim was killed. The other 2, including Jasmine, were held for 48 hours before police found the location and moved in. But by the time they got there, the kidnappers were already gone. They'd fled, left the remaining hostages alive. One of the kidnappers turned himself in a week later, said he couldn't live with what they'd done. He gave up his partners. They were all arrested, all convicted. Jasmine Carter spent a year in trauma therapy after that. She couldn't work. She couldn't function. She had PTSD so severe she couldn't leave her apartment for months. When she finally recovered enough to rebuild her life, she left the States and came here. Started over. Became a crisis counselor, probably because Seo-jun interrupted. Because she survived a crisis and wanted to help others survive theirs. The investigator paused. Yes, sir. That's the theory. Seo-jun felt his hands go numb. Where was the warehouse? Incheon. The industrial district. The investigator gave him an address. Do you want me to find out more? No, Seo-jun said. His voice was hollow. No, that's enough. He hung up and sat in his office and felt the world reshape itself around a terrible truth he wasn't ready to face. 6 years ago, Jasmine Carter had been kidnapped and held in a warehouse in Incheon. 6 years ago, Seo-jun had been a very different man. Still building his empire. Still involved in the kinds of businesses that operated in gray areas. Still working with people who didn't ask questions and didn't expect answers. 6 years ago, before his wife and daughter died, he'd been part of an operation. Not a kidnapping, he'd never been involved in anything that direct. But money laundering. Paying off people who needed to disappear. Providing resources to groups that did work he didn't want to know the details of. And one of those groups, a small gang he'd helped fund because they'd promised a return on investment, had been involved in a kidnapping that went wrong. He'd heard about it afterward. Heard that they'd panicked, killed someone, fled the scene. He'd cut ties immediately, made sure nothing could trace back to him. He'd considered it a business decision, a necessary step to protect himself. He'd never thought about the victims. He'd never asked their names. He'd certainly never imagined that one of them would, 6 years later, save his life with her voice on a phone. Seo-jun stood up and walked to the window. The Han River spread out below him, dark and wide. He pressed his palm against the glass and felt the cold seep through. She doesn't remember me because I never spoke to her that night, he said aloud to the empty office. But I was there. I funded the people who took her. I'm the reason she was in that warehouse. I'm the reason she spent a year unable to function. I'm the reason she had to leave her country and start over. He closed his eyes, and 6 years later she saved my life. She talked me down from a balcony. She spent 3 hours listening to me talk about my pain, about losing my wife and daughter, about the guilt that was eating me alive. And she didn't know. She had no idea that the man she was saving was connected to the worst thing that had ever happened to her. The realization was so enormous it didn't fit inside his body. It pressed against his ribs, against his lungs, against every part of him until he thought he might shatter from the weight of it. He had a debt to her, a debt so large it could never be repaid. But he also had a crime against her, a harm so profound that no apology, no amount of money, no gesture of gratitude could ever come close to making it right. And she didn't remember. Her mind had locked that time away, protected her by erasing the details. But her body remembered. That's why she had panic attacks around him. That's why her hands shook when their eyes met. That's why she told him to leave her alone with such vehemence. Her subconscious recognized him. Not his face, he'd never been at the warehouse. But something. His voice. His presence. Some detail her conscious mind couldn't access but her body was screaming about. Seo-jun turned away from the window. He picked up his phone. He deleted the investigator's number. He burned the file. He made a decision that felt like tearing his own heart out. He would leave her alone. Completely. Forever. He would never try to repay the debt. He would never tell her the truth. He would let her live her quiet, careful life without knowing that the man she'd saved had once been the architect of her trauma. It was the only honorable choice. It was also the most painful thing he'd ever done. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. 3 weeks later, Seo-jun got a phone call at 2 a.m. It was Park, and his voice was tight with controlled urgency. "Sir, there's a situation. You need to come to the office now." Seo-jun dressed quickly and arrived at his building 20 minutes later. Park met him in the lobby with 2 other security personnel, their faces grim. "What happened?" "There's a man in your office," Park said. "He got past building security somehow, disabled the alarms. He's been there for at least an hour. He's armed, and he's asking for you specifically." Seo-jun's blood went cold. "Who is he?" Park hesitated. "He says his name is Marcus Webb. American. Former police officer. He says he has information you need to hear, and if you don't come up, he's going to start making phone calls to people you don't want knowing your business." They took the elevator up in tense silence. Seo-jun's mind was racing. Marcus Webb. The name meant nothing to him. The building security had let the man through without any alerts, which meant he had credentials or connections that made him seem legitimate. The office door was closed. Park positioned himself and the other security personnel strategically before opening it. Inside, sitting in Seo-jun's chair with his feet on the desk, was a white man in his 40s. He was wearing jeans and a leather jacket, and there was a gun on the desk in front of him, not pointed at anyone, just there. "A statement." "Marcus Webb," the man said. "Thanks for coming." Seo-jun walked into the room slowly. Park stayed at the door. "What do you want?" "Your cooperation," Marcus said. "See, I've been looking for someone. A woman. She ran away from me a few years back, and I've been tracking her ever since. And imagine my surprise when I find out she's been living here in Seoul, working as a crisis counselor, and you," he pointed at Seo-jun, "have been paying very close attention to her." Seo-jun's entire body went rigid. "Jasmine." Marcus smiled. "So you do know her? Good. That makes this easier." "Get to the point," Seo-jun said. His voice was flat, dangerous. "The point," Marcus said, "is that Jasmine Carter knows something that could ruin my life. She doesn't know she knows it, but it's in there, locked away in that traumatized little brain of hers. And I need to make sure she never remembers." "What did you do to her?" Seo-jun's hands were clenched so tight his nails were cutting into his palms. Marcus leaned back in the chair. 6 years ago, I was a detective in the NYPD. I was also on the payroll of some people who didn't like being investigated. When a kidnapping case came through that could have exposed my connections, I made sure it got mishandled. I fed information to the kidnappers. I delayed the police response. I made sure evidence disappeared. One of the victims died because I slowed down the investigation. And Jasmine Carter was there. She saw things. She heard things. If she ever remembers, if she ever goes to the authorities with what she knows, I go to prison for a very long time." Seo-jun felt his vision narrow to a point. "You set up the kidnapping. You're the reason she was held in that warehouse for 2 days." Marcus shrugged. "I'm the reason she's still alive, technically. Could have gone a lot worse. But that's not the point. The point is, she's a loose end, and I need you to help me tie her up." "Why would I help you do anything?" "Because Marcus said, if you don't, I'll kill her myself. And then I'll make sure everyone knows about your connections to the gang that did the kidnapping. I've done my research, Kang Seo-jun. I know you funded those idiots. I know your money paid for the warehouse they used. You're just as guilty as I am, which means you're just as motivated to keep her quiet." Seo-jun looked at this man, this corrupt cop who had destroyed Jasmine's life for his own convenience, and felt a rage so pure it was almost transcendent. "Get out of my office." Marcus stood up slowly, picking up his gun. "Think about my offer. I'll give you 24 hours. Either you help me make sure Jasmine stays quiet, or I handle it myself. And trust me, my way is a lot messier." He walked toward the door. Park stepped aside, his hand hovering near his weapon. Marcus paused at the threshold and looked back at Seo-jun. "One more thing. She saved your life, didn't she? That night on the phone. I've been listening to recordings of her calls from the hotline. Very thorough, your Jasmine. very good at talking people down from edges. It would be a shame if the man she saved ended up being the reason she died. He left. The office fell into heavy silence. Seo-jun stood there, his body vibrating with barely contained violence, and tried to think through the rage. Park closed the door and spoke carefully. "Sir, we need to call the police." "No," Seo-jun said. "Why not?" "Because," Seo-jun said, turning to face him, "if we involve the police, this man will disappear or he'll follow through on his threat. And if he's telling the truth about having evidence of my connections to that kidnapping, it won't matter if we arrest him. The damage will be done. So what do? "We protect her," Seo-jun said. "We keep her safe until I can figure out how to eliminate this threat permanently." Park's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted into alignment. "Understood, sir." "Assign a security detail," Seo-jun said. "Rotating shifts, discreet. She can't know she's being watched. And find out everything about Marcus Webb. Where he's staying, who he's contacted, what his resources are. I want to know every move he makes." Park nodded and left to make calls. Seo-jun sat down in his chair, the one Marcus had just vacated, and put his head in his hands. The debt had just become infinitely more complicated. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about survival. And the woman who had saved his life 6 years ago was about to need saving herself, whether she knew it or not. The next morning, Jasmine woke up from another nightmare. The same one she'd been having for weeks now. The dark room, the smell of gasoline, the voice speaking Korean. But this time there was something new. A face, not clear, not complete, but emerging from the shadows. A man looking at her, and the overwhelming sensation that she knew him, that she'd seen him before, that he was important in a way her waking mind couldn't understand. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and tried to hold on to the image. But it was already fading, slipping back into the locked part of her mind like water through her fingers. She got up, made coffee, went through her morning routine with mechanical precision. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was coming. The universe was trying to tell her something, and she was too afraid to listen. Her phone rang while she was getting dressed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello? Jasmine," a voice said. Male, American accent, familiar in a way that made her stomach drop. "Do you remember me?" She froze. "Who is this?" "This is Marcus," the voice said. "Marcus Webb. Your old partner from New York." The name hit her like cold water. Marcus. She remembered him, vaguely. They'd worked together at the crisis center before she'd moved to Seoul. He'd been friendly, charming, always offering to help, always asking questions about her past. "I need to talk to you," Marcus said, "about what happened 6 years ago. You need to remember, Jasmine. You need to remember what you saw." The phone slipped from her hand. It hit the floor, but she could still hear his voice coming through the speaker. "I'm in Seoul, Jasmine, and I'm not leaving until we have a conversation." She picked up the phone with shaking hands and ended the call. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and tried very hard not to fall apart. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, if your heart is racing and you need to know what happens next, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Because this story is about to go somewhere you never expected. The panic attack hit 30 minutes later. Jasmine was sitting at her kitchen table, trying to drink coffee, trying to convince herself that Marcus's call was nothing, just a strange coincidence, when her vision started to narrow. The coffee cup in her hand began to shake. Her breathing became shallow, rapid, insufficient. The room around her started to tilt, and she recognized the feeling immediately. PTSD. Triggered by something her conscious mind couldn't identify but her body remembered perfectly. She put the cup down before she dropped it. She pressed her palms flat against the table. 5 things she could see: the cup, the table, the window, the morning light, her own hands. For things she could hear: traffic outside, a neighbor's TV, her own breathing, the blood rushing in her ears. 3 things she could touch: the smooth surface of the table, the cool air on her face, the chair beneath her. It wasn't working. The techniques that usually pulled her back weren't catching. The panic was too strong, too immediate, and underneath it was something else. A memory trying to surface. A voice. Not Marcus's voice. Someone else. She closed her eyes and tried to push it back down, but it was like trying to hold back a wave with her bare hands. The memory came in fragments. A warehouse. Concrete floors. The smell of gasoline and rust. 3 people zip-tied to chairs. She'd been one of them. A middle-aged businessman to her right, a young woman to her left. And men. Several men. Wearing masks. Speaking Korean. One of them was pacing, agitated, yelling at the others. They'd made a mistake. They'd grabbed the wrong people. The businessman wasn't who they thought he was. The ransom wasn't going to work. They were panicking. And then a phone call. One of the kidnappers stepped away, spoke in low tones to someone on the phone. When he came back, his body language had changed. More confident, more certain. Someone had told him what to do. Someone had given him instructions. And then, hours later, another voice. American, male, speaking to the kidnappers in broken Korean, telling them to sit tight, to wait, that everything would be handled. Telling them that the police wouldn't be coming anytime soon, that they had time. Jasmine's eyes snapped open. Her breathing was coming in gasps now. That voice on the phone. The American man speaking to the kidnappers. That had been Marcus. She'd heard it 6 years ago, but she hadn't understood what it meant. She'd been too terrified, too focused on staying alive. But her subconscious had recorded every detail. And now, with Marcus calling her, with the sound of his voice fresh in her ears, her mind was finally putting the pieces together. Marcus had been at the warehouse. Not physically, but on the phone. He'd been the one telling the kidnappers what to do. He'd been the one coordinating the operation. He wasn't just a cop who mishandled the investigation. He'd been part of the kidnapping from the beginning. Jasmine stood up too fast. The room spun. She grabbed the edge of the table and steadied herself. She needed to call the police. She needed to report this. She needed. The doorbell rang. Jasmine froze. Nobody came to her apartment unannounced. Nobody knew where she lived except her co-workers at the call center. And they'd never shown up without calling first. The doorbell rang again. Jasmine moved quietly toward the door. She looked through the peephole and saw a man she didn't recognize. Korean, middle-aged, wearing a suit. He was holding what looked like a delivery box. She didn't open the door. "Can I help you?" she called through the wood. "Delivery for Jasmine Carter," the man said in Korean. "From a friend." "I don't have any friends who would send me packages," Jasmine said. Her hand was on her phone, ready to call for help. The man set the box down on the floor. "If you change your mind, it's here." He turned and walked away, disappearing down the stairwell. Jasmine waited 5 minutes before she opened the door. She picked up the box carefully, brought it inside, and opened it on her kitchen table with the same caution she'd use on a potential bomb. Inside was a phone. Just a phone, new, still in its packaging, with a note attached. The note was in English, written in clean, precise handwriting. "Miss Carter, you are in danger. The man who called you this morning is not who you think he is. He isn't Seoul and he intends to harm you. Please trust me. Use this phone. Cannot be traced. Call the number programmed into it. I can help you." There was no signature. Jasmine stared at the phone and the note for a long time. Every instinct she had screamed that this was a trap. Strange men leaving phones at her door. Anonymous notes claiming to offer help. This was how people got manipulated, controlled, hurt. But then she thought about Marcus, about his voice on the phone, about the way her body had reacted to Seo-jun in the restaurant, about the panic attacks and the fragments of memory that were getting stronger every day. And she made a choice that went against everything she'd taught herself about staying safe. She opened the phone. She dialed the number. It rang once. Seo-jun answered. "Miss Carter," he said. "Thank you for calling." Jasmine's hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. "You," she said. "You're the one who's been sending gifts. You're the one who approached me at the restaurant. And now you're leaving phones at my door? What the hell is going on?" "Please listen," Seo-jun said. "I know you don't trust me. I know I made you uncomfortable. But right now that doesn't matter. What matters is that the man who called you this morning is extremely dangerous. His name is Marcus Webb. He's a corrupt police officer from New York, and he was involved in your kidnapping 6 years ago. He's in Seoul because he's afraid you're going to remember details that could incriminate him, and he's going to try to silence you before that happens. Jasmine felt the room spin again. How do you know about my kidnapping? Because Seo-jun said, and his voice was heavy with something that sounded like grief. I was part of it. Not directly. I never met you. I never knew your name. But I funded the people who did it. I gave them money. I'm the reason you were in that warehouse. I'm the reason you spent a year in trauma therapy. I'm the reason you had to leave your country and start over. Jasmine sat down hard. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The world had just restructured itself around a truth so enormous it didn't fit inside her understanding of reality. You, she whispered. You're the one I've been afraid of. Not Marcus. You. Yes, Seo-jun said. Your body remembered me somehow. I don't know how, we never met. But something about me triggered your PTSD. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. Jasmine wanted to hang up. She wanted to throw the phone across the room. She wanted to run. But she was tired of running. She was tired of being afraid. So instead, she said, why are you telling me this? Because Seo-jun said, 6 years ago you saved my life. I called a suicide hotline. I was going to jump from my balcony. And a woman with a calm voice stayed on the phone with me for 3 hours and convinced me to wait until morning. That was you. I didn't know it until I heard your voice at the convenience store. But once I recognized it, I couldn't stop thinking about the debt I owed you. I tried to repay it by sending gifts, by offering gratitude. But then I found out about the kidnapping, and I realized the debt was more complicated than I thought. Jasmine was crying. She didn't know when she'd started, but tears were running down her face and she couldn't stop them. You ruined my life, she said, and then I saved yours. How is that fair? It's not, Seo-jun said. Nothing about this is fair. But right now, fair doesn't matter. What matters is that Marcus Webb is going to try to kill you. And I'm asking you to let me protect you. Not because you owe me. Not because I think it'll make us even. But because you deserve to live. And I'm in a position to make sure that happens. Jasmine sat there with the phone pressed to her ear and tried to make sense of any of this. The man who funded her kidnapping had turned out to be the man she'd talked down from suicide. The debt they owed each other was so tangled it couldn't be untangled. And now he was offering to protect her from the cop who'd orchestrated the whole thing. It was too much. It was too complicated. It was impossible. But her body was still screaming at her that danger was coming. And despite everything, despite the fear and the trauma and the anger, some part of her believed him. Okay, she said. Tell me what to do. The safe house was in Gangnam, on the top floor of a building Seo-jun owned. 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, security on every entrance. Park met her at the building entrance and escorted her upstairs without a word. Seo-jun was waiting in the living room when she arrived. He stood when she entered, and for the first time Jasmine looked at him directly. Really looked at him. Korean man, 40 years old, tall, well-built, expensive suit, kind eyes that were trying very hard to hide a guilt so profound it had its own weight. She looked at him and waited for the panic attack. Waited for her body to scream. Didn't. Instead, something else happened. She recognized him. Not from the warehouse. From the phone. 6 years ago, she'd spent 3 hours listening to a man talk about his pain. She'd heard him cry. She'd heard him laugh once. A bitter, broken sound. She'd heard him thank her at the end of the call. His voice so raw it had stayed with her for days afterward. This was that man. The suicidal stranger was standing in front of her, very much alive, offering her protection from the man who tried to kill her 6 years ago. The irony was almost funny. Almost. You look different than I imagined, Jasmine said. Seo-jun blinked. You imagined what I looked like? On the phone, Jasmine said. When you called. I always picture the people I'm talking to. It helps me stay present. You sounded, she paused, trying to find the right words, broken, but also strong, like you were holding yourself together with nothing but will. Seo-jun's expression shifted. Something in his eyes cracked open. That's exactly what I was doing. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Jasmine said, I don't forgive you. For the kidnapping. For funding the people who did it. I don't care that you didn't know. I don't care that it was just business. You ruined my life, and I don't forgive you for that. I understand, Seo-jun said. I don't forgive you either, Jasmine continued. For sending me gifts. For following me. For making me feel unsafe. You could have left me alone. You should have left me alone. But you didn't, and that was selfish. I know. But Jasmine took a breath. I'm here. Because you're right about Marcus. And because I'm tired of running. So I'm staying until this is over. And then I'm leaving. And I never want to see you again. Understood? Seo-jun nodded. Understood. Jasmine sat down on the couch. Her hands were shaking. Seo-jun sat across from her, careful to maintain distance, careful not to crowd her space. Park brought tea. Neither of them drank it. Tell me about Marcus, Jasmine said. What exactly is he planning? From what we've learned, Seo-jun said, Marcus Webb has been tracking you for 3 years. He knew you'd left New York. He knew you'd come to Seoul. But he wasn't sure if you remembered anything from the kidnapping that could incriminate him. He was watching, waiting. And then I started paying attention to you. I made donations in your name. I sent gifts. I approached you in public. And Marcus saw all of it. He thought we were connected. He thought maybe I was helping you remember. So he came here to tie up the loose end before it became a problem. Jasmine felt sick. He's going to kill me. He's going to try, Seo-jun said. But we're not going to let him. How are we going to stop him? We're going to give him what he wants, Seo-jun said. A meeting. Just you and him. He'll think he has the advantage. But we'll be ready. Jasmine stared at him. You want to use me as bait. I want to give you the chance to face the man who destroyed your life, Seo-jun said. To look him in the eye and know that he's never going to hurt you again. I want to give you closure. That's not closure, Jasmine said. That's revenge. Maybe it's both, Seo-jun said. Jasmine leaned back against the couch. Her head was pounding. Her whole body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She was so tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of running. Tired of the locked door in her mind that kept trying to open. What if I say no? Seo-jun's expression didn't change. Then we find another way. But Marcus isn't going to stop. He'll keep coming. He'll keep hunting you. And eventually he'll find an opening. This way, at least, we control the when and where. Jasmine closed her eyes. She thought about the warehouse. About the smell of gasoline. About the fear that had lived in her body for 6 years. About the way her hands still shook when someone stood too close. About the life she'd lost and the life she'd built to replace it. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Seo-jun. Okay, she said. Let's do it. The meeting was set for 2 days later. An abandoned warehouse in Incheon. The same district where Jasmine had been held 6 years ago. Marcus had chosen the location, which told Seo-jun everything he needed to know about the man's psychology. He wanted Jasmine to be afraid. He wanted her to remember. He wanted her to understand that he controlled the space. But Marcus didn't know that Seo-jun had spent the last 48 hours turning that warehouse into a trap. Security cameras hidden in every corner. Snipers on the roof of the adjacent building. Park and 4 other men positioned strategically around the perimeter. And Jasmine, standing in the center of the warehouse floor, waiting. She was wearing a wire. Her instructions were simple. Keep Marcus talking, get him to confess, and when the signal came, get down. Seo-jun was watching from a van parked half a block away. His eyes on the monitors showing every angle of the warehouse. His heart was pounding. His hands were sweating. He'd been in dangerous situations before. He'd orchestrated operations that required precision and timing and the willingness to accept casualties. But this was different. This was Jasmine, standing in a warehouse that looked exactly like the one where she'd been traumatized, waiting for the man who'd orchestrated that trauma to arrive. If anything went wrong, if Marcus came in with backup, or if he didn't follow the script, or if Jasmine froze at the critical moment, she could die. And Seo-jun would be responsible. Again, Marcus arrived exactly on time. He walked into the warehouse alone, hands in his pockets, casual. He saw Jasmine and smiled. "There you are," he said. "I was starting to think you weren't going to show." Jasmine's voice came through the wire, steady despite the fear Seo-jun could see in her posture on the monitors. "You said you wanted to talk. So talk." Marcus walked closer. Not too close, but close enough that Jasmine had to resist the urge to step back. "I've been thinking about that night," Marcus said. 6 years ago. You were there. You saw things, heard things, and I need to know what you remember." Jasmine's breathing was controlled, measured. She was using the techniques she taught other people. "I remember being terrified. I remember thinking I was going to die." "What else?" Marcus's voice was harder now. "What else do you remember, Jasmine?" "I remember your voice," Jasmine said. "On the phone, talking to the kidnappers, telling them what to do, telling them to wait. You were part of it. You set it up." Marcus's smile disappeared. "Yeah, I did. And you're the only person who knows that. Which is why we're here." "Why did you do it?" Jasmine asked. "The businessman they grabbed, he was investigating my connections. If he'd lived, if he'd talked, I would have gone to prison. So I made sure the kidnapping happened. I made sure the police response was slow. And I made sure the evidence disappeared. One person died." Jasmine's voice cracked slightly. "He had a family. So did I," Marcus said. "I had a career. I had a future. And I wasn't going to let some self-righteous businessman destroy it. So yeah, I set you up. I set all of you up. And I'd do it again." In the van, Seo-jun gave the signal. Park and the others moved in. Marcus saw them coming and pulled a gun. But he was too slow. Park had him on the ground in seconds, weapon kicked away, hands behind his back. Police sirens rose in the distance. Real police this time, one Seo-jun had contacted through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. Jasmine stood in the center of the warehouse, breathing hard, her whole body shaking. Seo-jun ran from the van. He got to her just as her legs gave out. He caught her before she hit the ground, and she didn't push him away. She just grabbed onto his jacket and held on like he was the only thing keeping her upright. "It's over," Seo-jun said quietly. "You're safe," he confessed. "They have everything on tape. He's going to prison." Jasmine nodded against his chest. She was crying, but the sound was different than he'd ever heard before. Not despair, not fear, relief. The door in her mind that had been locked for 6 years had finally blown open, and all the pain had come flooding out, and now, finally, it could start to drain away. The police arrived. They took Marcus into custody. Jasmine gave her statement calm and clear, the voice of someone who had survived the worst and come out the other side. Seo-jun stayed with her through all of it, silent, present, a wall between her and everything that wanted to consume her. When it was finally over, when Marcus was gone and the police had left and it was just the two of them standing in the empty warehouse as the sun came up, Jasmine turned to Seo-jun. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me," Seo-jun replied. "Yes, I do. You didn't have to help me. You could have walked away. You should have walked away. But you didn't." Seo-jun looked at her. "I owed you a debt. This doesn't make us even," Jasmine said. "You destroyed my life 6 years ago, and I saved yours. The scales don't balance. They never will. I know. So what do we do now?" Seo-jun asked quietly. "I don't know," Jasmine said. "And then, after a long silence, maybe we start over. Maybe we meet as two people who have nothing to do with the past. Two people who are just trying to figure out how to move forward." Seo-jun looked at her, this woman who had saved his life without knowing it, who he had harmed without meeting her, whose existence had become tangled with his in ways that defied easy answers. "Can we do that?" he asked. "I don't know," Jasmine said again. "But I'd like to try." They stood in that warehouse as the morning light came through the broken windows, and neither of them moved. Two people whose debts to each other could never be paid. Two people whose harm and healing were so intertwined they couldn't be separated. Two people who had every reason to walk away and no reason to stay. But they stayed anyway, not because it made sense, not because it was fair, but because sometimes the only way forward is through the impossible middle, where forgiveness and guilt live in the same space, and the only choice is to see what happens when you stop running. 6 months later, Jasmine and Seo-jun sat in a cafe in Itaewon. They met there once a week now, same table, same time. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about debts or kidnappings or suicide hotlines. They talked about small things. Books they were reading, food they'd tried, the weather, the city, their lives that were slowly, carefully, being rebuilt brick by brick. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't romance. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name. Two people learning to exist in the same space without being consumed by what they'd done to each other. Learning to see each other as human. Learning to breathe. One day, maybe, they would be able to answer the question of whether redemption was possible. Whether harm could be forgiven. Whether two people on opposite sides of a trauma could ever find peace. But for now, they just sat in a cafe and drank their coffee and let the silence between them be enough. If the story moved you, if you felt every impossible choice and every moment of grace in the middle of trauma, then don't let this be the end. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe in complicated redemption, and subscribe for more stories about people who face the hardest truths and find a way forward anyway. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying.